Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. Right now, I'm suffering the consequences of a job not finished correctly. When we bought our house, we had a beautiful redwood stained deck on the back of the house. The redwood stain is peeling off like crazy right now. I asked my neighbor. I found out that the previous owner had used linseed oil on the deck for years and years, and just before selling it, decided that they would paint over it with a redwood stain. Painting over linseed oil with a redwood stain doesn't work, I can tell you firsthand. The job was not done completely. They should have dried out the wood. It was not done thoroughly. And so I'm suffering the consequences of that as I figure out what to do with that deck. Jobs done incompletely are not effective. And the rest of the book of Joshua is really a story of a job done incompletely. It's a story of God's action for his people. That's complete. That's thorough. This army that lost at Ai comes back after the incident with Achan and after the punishment of Achan, the stoning of his family, and takes that little city. It's interesting, Joshua's not taking any chances this time. In chapter 8, you might remember in chapter 7, he had 2,000 or 3,000 men go up against Ai. In chapter 8, he sends 30,000 up against Ai, and this time they take the city. The rest of the book of Joshua describes this conquest as it goes to the south part of Israel, and then the conquest as it goes central Israel and then northern Israel, and how God all the way through has his hand involved in delivering this land to these people of Israel. There's one occasion when as the enemy is taking flight, we're told God rains great hailstones down upon them. So more were killed by the hailstones than by the Israelites. God's heavenly artillery does more damage than Joshua's earthly artillery. Another time we're told that Joshua couldn't finish the battle because the daylight was waning. So God allowed the sun to stand still so that Joshua could finish that battle. But in the midst of all of this in the story, you'll find little hints that it wasn't complete. It'll describe, the book of Joshua will describe that Israel took all of this land, and then it'll add, except these cities. They did not thoroughly cleanse the land of its inhabitants as God had told them to do, and that will come back to haunt them. Now, there are a couple of reasons they didn't. One is probably they just got lazy. And once they had enough land for them to settle in, they didn't worry about the rest of the inhabitants. Another reason is most of the area that they took was in the hill country. The area that they did not take was in the plains along the Jordan River and along the Mediterranean Sea. Now, along the Mediterranean Sea, you had a group of folks there that we'll hear a lot more about in the future, called the Philistines. And the Philistines possessed the ultimate weapon of that day, chariots with iron wheels. Now, chariots were pretty ineffective in the hill country, so Israel really didn't have a problem in the hill country, but they scared the bejeebers out of them down in the plains. And they refused to fight against those Philistines in the plains. So those plains remained in the hands of the Philistines for many, many years. And the Philistines became a thorn in the flesh to Israel. Because Israel did not trust God to be able to wipe out all the enemies, Israel settled for a job that was incomplete. And they suffered the consequences. The consequences you'll see down through the history of the Old Testament. As they lived side by side with these pagan inhabitants of the land, they were not the positive influence on the pagans. The pagans were the negative influence on Israel. And Israel began to worship the Baals. And you'll remember what that means. It's a fertility cult that involves the temple prostitutes, that involves trying to get the crops to grow, trying to get the rain to fall. And Israel's focus all too often became on the productivity of the land rather than on Yahweh, the God who had brought them to that land. The job was incomplete, and because of that, Israel suffered the consequences. The grace in the story, the grace in this incident, is that God does not give up on this nation. Even though the nation doesn't follow his instructions, even though the nation doesn't clean out the land, and even though they continually chase after other gods, they're still God's people. He's still going to hang with them. He's still going to draw them back to him. And he is still going to send his Savior for all of the world within that nation.